What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a normal conversation, only to be blindsided by a host who seems more interested in tearing him down than celebrating his work? In just 33 seconds of one shocking comment, Tamron Hall would go from smiling host to public villain, triggering a walkout that nobody saw coming. Samuel L. Jackson had done hundreds of interviews, thousands, probably. He knew how these things worked. You sit down, you talk about your new project, you share a funny story or two, and everyone goes home happy. That's the dance. That's how it's supposed to go. So when he walked onto the set of the Tamron Hall show that afternoon, he had no reason to think this would be any different. The audience clapped as he made his way to the guest chair. Tamron stood up from behind her desk, all smiles and warmth, extending her hand for a shake. Samuel took it, gave her that signature smile of his, and settled into his seat. "Welcome, welcome," Tamron said, her voice bright and energetic. "We are so excited to have you here today." "Happy to be here," Samuel replied, getting comfortable. "Thanks for having me." The interview started off normal enough. They talked about his latest film, a thriller that had just hit theaters the week before. Samuel spoke passionately about the character he played, a detective tracking down a serial killer. He talked about the director's vision, about the intense preparation he'd done for the role. Tamron nodded along, asking the usual questions. "Now, this character is very different from some of your other roles," Tamron said, leaning forward slightly. "How did you approach getting into his headspace?" Samuel launched into an explanation about the research he'd done, the police officers he'd shadowed, the psychology books he'd read to understand how detectives think. It was the kind of answer actors give when they've really invested themselves in a project. Thoughtful, detailed, professional. Tamron listened, but there was something in her expression that was hard to read. Something that wasn't quite right. Samuel couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt a shift in the air, a subtle change in her energy. "That's fascinating," Tamron said when he finished, though her tone had cooled slightly. "You know, speaking of preparation, I have to ask about something that's been circulating online." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What's that?" "Well," Tamron said, and now there was definitely something different in her voice. Something sharp. "There have been some people questioning whether you're still relevant in today's Hollywood, whether your time is kind of, past." The audience went quiet. Samuel's smile faded just a bit. He straightened up in his chair. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, his tone measured but clearly caught off guard. "I mean, you've been in the industry for a long time," Tamron continued, and there was almost a dismissive quality to the way she said it. "Some critics are saying that maybe you're holding on to roles that should go to younger actors. Fresher faces. What do you say to that?" Samuel stared at her for a moment, processing what he'd just heard. This wasn't a question, this was an attack, and it had come out of nowhere. "Fresher faces?" he repeated slowly. "Are you asking me if I think I'm too old to act?" "Not too old," Tamron said, waving her hand as if that would soften the blow. "Just maybe not as in demand as you used to be. I mean, when was the last time you had a really big hit? One that people actually talked about?" The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not what they'd come to see. Samuel's jaw tightened. He took a breath, clearly trying to keep his composure. "I think my work speaks for itself," he said carefully. "I've been fortunate to have a career that spanned decades, and I'm grateful for every opportunity I get." Sure, Tamron said, but she wasn't letting it go. "But you have to admit, Hollywood has changed. There are so many talented young actors coming up. Don't you think it's kind of selfish to keep taking roles when you could step aside and let someone else have a chance?" That word hung in the air. Selfish. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Selfish?" "Well, yeah," Tamron said, leaning back in her chair like she was just making casual conversation. "I mean, you've had your time in the spotlight. You've made your money. Why not let the next generation shine?" Samuel looked at her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. And honestly, neither could the audience. There were a few gasps, some murmurs. This had gone from uncomfortable to outright hostile. "Let me get this straight," Samuel said, his voice low and controlled. "You invited me onto your show to tell me that I should quit acting?" "I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking," Tamron replied, shrugging. "It's not personal. It's just, the reality of the business." "The reality of the business?" Samuel repeated, shaking his head. "And what exactly qualifies you to tell me about the reality of the business? Have you spent 40 years building a career? Have you worked your way up from nothing to become one of the most recognized faces in cinema?" Tamron's smile faltered. "I'm a journalist. It's my job to ask tough questions." Tough questions? Samuel's voice rose slightly. There's a difference between tough questions and disrespect. You didn't bring me here to have a conversation. You brought me here to try and embarrass me. That's not true. Tamron protested, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. I'm just trying to have an honest discussion. Honest? Samuel let out a short, bitter laugh. There's nothing honest about this. You ambushed me. You waited until I was sitting here, in front of your audience, to start throwing these accusations at me. They're not accusations, Tamron said, her tone getting defensive now. I'm asking legitimate questions about your career trajectory. My career trajectory is none of your damn business, Samuel shot back. And even if it was, you don't get to sit there and tell me that I'm too old or not relevant anymore. You don't have that right. The energy in the studio had completely shifted. What started as a standard talk show interview had turned into a full-blown confrontation. The crew behind the cameras looked at each other nervously. The audience sat in stunned silence. I think you're overreacting, Tamron said, trying to regain control of the situation. I didn't mean any offense. You didn't mean any offense? Samuel's voice was sharp now, cutting through the tension like a knife. How else was I supposed to take it? You basically called me irrelevant and selfish to my face. I was just presenting a perspective, Tamron insisted, a viewpoint that exists out there. A viewpoint? Samuel repeated, shaking his head. You know what? I don't care whose viewpoint it is. The fact that you thought it was appropriate to bring that up in this context, in this way, tells me everything I need to know about your intentions. Tamron's face hardened. My intentions are to create compelling television. Compelling television? Samuel laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Is that what you call this? Trying to humiliate your guests for ratings? Nobody's trying to humiliate anyone, Tamron said, but her voice had taken on an edge. You're being incredibly defensive. Defensive? Samuel leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. You disrespected me. You disrespected my career. You disrespected every actor who's worked hard to build something lasting in this industry. And now you're trying to make it seem like I'm the problem for calling you out on it? I think you need to calm down, Tamron said, and that was a mistake. Samuel's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me? You're getting very aggressive, Tamron continued, digging herself deeper. I'm just trying to have a civil conversation. There's nothing civil about what you've been doing, Samuel said, his voice cold. And telling me to calm down? That's the oldest trick in the book. Say something offensive, then act like the other person is crazy for being upset about it. The audience was completely silent now, watching this train wreck unfold in real time. Some people had their hands over their mouths. Others just stared, wide-eyed. I really think you're misinterpreting my questions. Tamron tried again, but she was losing ground fast. I'm not misinterpreting anything, Samuel said firmly. You made yourself perfectly clear. You think I'm washed up. You think I should step aside. You think my presence in Hollywood is somehow preventing other people from succeeding? That's not what I said, Tamron protested. That's exactly what you said, Samuel countered. Maybe not in those exact words, but that was the message. And you know what the worst part is? You didn't even have the courage to own it. You hid behind this idea of asking tough questions, like that gives you permission to say whatever you want. Tamron opened her mouth to respond, but Samuel held up his hand. No, I'm not done, he said. You want to know what's really selfish? Inviting someone onto your show under the pretense of promoting their work, then using that platform to tear them down. That's selfish. That's cruel. And that's exactly what you did here today. I think you're being unfair, Tamron said, but her voice was weak now. Unfair? Samuel shook his head slowly. You don't get to talk to me about fair. You crossed a line today. A big one. There was a long pause. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Samuel looked at Tamron, then at the audience, then back at Tamron. You know what? He said quietly. I don't need this. I don't need to sit here and be insulted by someone who clearly has no respect for me or my work. He stood up. The sudden movement made Tamron flinch slightly. Wait, where are you going? She asked, panic creeping into her voice. I'm leaving, Samuel said simply. This interview is over. You can't just leave, Tamron said, standing up as well. We're in the middle of taping. Watch me, Samuel replied. He started removing his microphone, unhooking it from his shirt. Please, sit back down, Tamron said, trying to sound authoritative but failing. Let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, Samuel said, dropping the microphone on the chair. You said what you wanted to say. Now I'm doing what I need to do. But we still have 10 more minutes. Tamron said, desperation evident in her voice now. What am I supposed to do with 10 minutes? Samuel stopped and turned to face her one last time. That's your problem, not mine. Maybe you can spend that time thinking about how to treat your guests with respect. The audience gasped again. Some people started clapping. Uncertain applause that grew louder as Samuel walked toward the exit. Samuel, please! Tamron called after him, but he didn't stop, didn't even look back. The studio doors opened and Samuel L. Jackson walked through them, leaving Tamron Hall standing alone on her stage, speechless. The audience was still clapping, some of them standing now. The crew stood frozen, unsure what to do. Tamron looked at the cameras, then at her producers off stage. Her face was flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment. She'd lost control of her own show, and everyone had seen it happen. Well, she said, trying to compose herself, that was unexpected. But nobody was buying it. The damage was done. She'd pushed one of Hollywood's most respected actors too far, and he'd walked out on her, on live television, in front of everyone. A producer rushed onto the stage, whispering urgently in Tamron's ear. She nodded, looking defeated. The cameras cut, and the audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Samuel, meanwhile, was already down the hallway, his security detail flanking him. His assistant rushed to catch up, out of breath. "Are you okay?" she asked. Samuel nodded, his jaw still tight. "I'm fine. Just get me out of here." "That was intense," his assistant said as they headed toward the exit. "She crossed a line," Samuel said quietly. "I've dealt with tough interviews before. I've handled controversial questions. But that was disrespectful. And I'm not going to sit there and let anyone talk to me like that." They pushed through the back doors of the studio, emerging into the bright afternoon sunlight. Samuel took a deep breath, letting the tension start to drain from his shoulders. "Should we release a statement?" his assistant asked. "No," Samuel said. "I said what I needed to say in there. People can make up their own minds about what happened." And they would. Within hours, clips of the interview would be everywhere. Social media would explode with reactions. Think pieces would be written. Everyone would have an opinion. But right now, in this moment, Samuel just wanted to go home. He'd walked away with his dignity intact, and that was what mattered. He hadn't lost his temper, hadn't said anything he'd regret later. He'd simply stood up for himself and left a situation that had become intolerable. Back inside the studio, Tamron was dealing with the fallout. The audience had been dismissed early, confused and chattering amongst themselves as they filed out. The crew was packing up equipment, their faces carefully neutral. Nobody wanted to be the one to say what everyone was thinking. Tamron sat in her chair, staring at nothing. Her producer approached cautiously. "We need to figure out what we're going to air," he said gently. "I know," Tamron replied, her voice flat. "This is going to be everywhere," the producer continued. "We need to get ahead of it." Tamron nodded, but she looked shell-shocked. Whatever she'd been trying to accomplish with those questions, this was not the outcome she'd expected. She thought she was being provocative, pushing for good television. Instead, she'd alienated one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood and made herself look petty and mean-spirited in the process. "How did this happen?" she asked, more to herself than to anyone else. The producer didn't have an answer, because the truth was, it happened exactly the way these things always happen. Someone got too confident, pushed too hard, and forgot that the person sitting across from them was a human being who deserved respect. Samuel L. Jackson had reminded everyone of that today. Not with violence or cruelty, but by simply refusing to participate in his own humiliation. He'd drawn a line, and when that line was crossed, he'd walked away. It was a moment of principle in an industry that often seems to have forgotten what principles are. And whether people agreed with how he handled it or not, one thing was certain: Samuel had made his point. Loud and clear, the cameras had captured everything. The disrespect, the confrontation, the walkout. It was all there, preserved forever on tape. And when people watched it back, they'd see exactly what had transpired. They'd hear Tamron's questions. They'd see Samuel's reactions. They'd witness the moment when a professional decided he'd had enough. In the hours and days that followed, the conversation would shift and change. Some would criticize Samuel for walking out. Others would applaud him for standing up for himself. Media outlets would debate whether Tamron had crossed a line or whether Samuel had overreacted. Everyone would have their take, their hot opinion, their analysis of what it all meant. But none of that mattered in the moment. In the moment, it was simple. A host had disrespected her guest. The guest had called her out on it. And when she doubled down instead of apologizing, he left. That's what happened. That's the story. No more complicated than that. Samuel's car pulled away from the sane studio, taking him back to his life, his career, his work that spoke for itself. He'd done thousands of interviews, and he'd do thousands more. But this one would be remembered, not because of anything he said about his new film, but because of what he said about respect, dignity, and knowing when to walk away. Tamron remained in that studio, facing questions from her team, already preparing for the storm of public opinion that was about to hit. She'd wanted compelling television, and she'd gotten it, just not in the way she'd hoped, because at the end of the day, truly compelling television doesn't come from tearing people down. It comes from building them up, from genuine conversation, from mutual respect between host and guest. Tamron had forgotten that, or maybe she'd never learned it in the first place. And Samuel L. Jackson had just given her, and everyone watching, a masterclass in what happens when you forget. You lose. You lose your guest. You lose your audience's respect. You lose the moral high ground. You lose it all. In 33 seconds, with one thoughtless comment about relevance and age, and giving up what he'd spent a lifetime building, Tamron Hall had turned what should have been a simple promotional interview into a viral moment of controversy. She'd made herself the villain of her own show. And Samuel just walked away, head held high, dignity intact, career still thriving, despite what anyone might say. Because the truth is, people like Samuel L. Jackson don't become irrelevant. They don't fade away because someone thinks they should. They continue doing what they love, what they're good at, what they've earned the right to do. And no talk show host, no matter how big their platform, can take that away from them. That's the real lesson here. Not about Hollywood politics or generational divides or any of the other narratives people would try to spin. The lesson is about respect, about treating people the way they deserve to be treated, regardless of who they are or what you think you can gain by putting them down. Tamron learned that lesson the hard way, in front of cameras, in front of an audience, in front of the world. And Samuel, he didn't need to learn anything. He already knew his worth. And when someone tried to diminish it, he simply chose not to give them that power. He walked away. And in doing so, he proved exactly why he's still one of the most respected actors in the business. Because respect isn't just something you receive, it's something you demand, something you uphold, something you refuse to compromise on, even when the cameras are rolling.